Record.
Yeah, my name's Zoe Alexander. I'm Director of Strategy at Nest Corporation.
Good morning. My name's Adrian Boulding. I'm Director of Policy at Now Pensions and Automatic Enrolment Master Trust with nearly 2 million members.
Good morning. I'm Colin Clark. I'm Head of Product Policy Strategy for Legal and General Investment Management.
Good morning. I'm Greg McClyman, Director of Policy and External Affairs at the People's Pension.
Great. Can I stress we don't want you or necessarily pressurise you to all answer every question. But if you've got something different to add, that will be really, really good. Ruth, will you begin, please?
Thank you. I will give you an easy starter, which would be useful to have all your views on, but if they differ from those that have come before. Zoe, to start with you and move along. The committee in the previous Parliament described auto-enrolment as a tremendous success. And obviously we've got millions of people now, millions more people in pensions. Is it still the case that it's a success now that the market's starting to mature?
I'd say absolutely it is. I think we've seen a kind of phenomenal impact in terms of inertia working in the way that people anticipated that it would. So we've got now nearly 10 million people saving. In Nest alone, we've got 7.4 million members, of whom around half are active at any one time, 600,000 employers. And I think in particular, when you look at the impact on lower earners and on women who might previously not been saving, we've got many, many more people saving. So I think in terms of the kind of providing a structural foundation now for second-tier saving in the private sector, we're in a really phenomenal place. I think it is a foundation, so there's some really big questions now for government and for the industry in terms of how we build on that foundation and continue to make a success of the policy. I think that there's two things I bring out in that respect. One is how we try to get people saving at the right level for them, and we bring in excluded groups who might otherwise be saving but aren't captured by auto-enrolment, like the self-employed and things like multiple job holders. And I think there's some really finely balanced policy judgments to be made about how you do that and how you get people saving the right level. Because whilst structurally, you know, if you look at 8%, when we get to 8% in April this year, we've come a long way. It's nowhere near the kind of levels that people are saving at in other OECD countries. So do we push it higher? I think there'll be lots of voices saying let's push it higher, but at the same time, lots of our membership is kind of earning persistently between kind of £10,000 and £18,000, and for them it's a real hit. So particularly if you remove the LEL, which we're very supportive of, removing the lower earnings limit. If you're earning persistently £12,000, £13,000, 8% on your whole salary is a lot of money. So are the things we do as potentially we push contributions up to make it more palatable for those people to continue to save. And that's why Nest is looking at building elements of liquidity into savings through our sidecar trial. So can you enable people to build a liquid asset alongside their pension saving in a sustainable way? So there's lots of ideas there, and I think there's a lot of thinking still to do to get those judgments right. That's fine. And the other thing, just briefly, I'd say is retirement. So we need to think about, in the context of freedom and choice, how do we help people make that transition from an inert state generally in accumulation through to accumulation in a safe way that works for them.
Anyone want anything new to add to that?
Yes, if I might. I think the key thing is that automatic enrolment has been a great success for middle earners, but not for low earners. So the £10,000 threshold, which are required to earn, excludes 3.3 million people from partaking in automatic enrolment. The £6,132, which you don't get counted towards saving, is particularly harsh on part-timers because it's a large proportion of their earnings. And if you're a part-timer with more than one job, it's deducted at each of your jobs. And I think the other thing in particular, which is very...
Do you think for those on very low earnings, there should be universal credit payment? Too. I mean, we're all supposed to be in favour. We give the rich, we shovel money for pensions to the very rich. Could we not use universal credit to pay for poorer people's
contribution? I think that would be an excellent idea. Yes. Right. Yes. I think the point where I'm particularly concerned about low earners is that there are two forms of tax relief, and roughly half of the automatic enrolment schemes follow the net pay system of tax relief. It's great for medium and high earners. It has a particular disadvantage for low earners in that somebody who is not a taxpayer in a net pay scheme, so an individual earning below £12,500, does not get tax relief. At the worst, for somebody at £12,500, that costs them £64 per year. And the way the tax system works, that is £64 out of their take-home pay, an amount of money that might pay for a child's school uniform, for instance. And it is just a quirk of the tax system that those in relief at source schemes get this, those in net pay schemes are denied that. We have pushed the Treasury hard on this, and we will continue to push hard on it.
You may do so as well. Thank you. Colin?
Yes, so within Legal in General, we've enrolled over 2.9 million people since the start, and our opt-out rates have been consistently low. The average opt-out rate that we've had since the beginning is about 6.2%. And even for re-enrolment rates, although they're not as low as the first-time opt-out rates, it's about 30% for re-enrolment. But we think that's a good news story because that means that 70% of people that were enrolled and opted out the first time have decided to stay in the second time.
Greg, you've got the best name of all these. What's the scope of your organisation before you answer Ruth's question, please?
Thank you, Frank. The People's Pension is 4.25 million members, serves 85,000 employers, and currently has assets of around 5 billion, depending on market movements in any given day, and as a background in serving the construction industry specifically in terms of pension arrangements, and since auto-enrolment has expanded to serve the whole population, so finds itself as the largest master trust outside of the government-backed scheme Nest. In terms of your question, Frank, I just make 2 points, which I guess build on what's been said so far. The first is auto-enrolment has been a success. So far, so good, but of course there's always bumps in the road. But it is always worth remembering that reflects an unusual process of genuine long-term policy making and cross-party consensus. It started, as you'll be aware, in the 2001 Parliament. 2005 Parliament took the Pensions Commission recommendations and legislated. 2010 Parliament proceeded with auto-enrolment and got the staging in a good place. And even the 2015 Parliament with Master Trust authorisation to strengthen the protections for customers. So I think really that's central to the success. And the second thing, long-term policy making, and really importantly, going with the grain of human nature. The fact is that most of us prefer to favour the short term over the long term, and harnessing that inertia, as Zoe pointed out, has been really powerful. There's a question about what happens when contributions rise significantly in April to 8%, so we shouldn't count our chickens. People have got a tendency of confounding experts, as we know only too well. So I think we have to be cautious about April. But beyond April, if things go well, I would raise again the issue which has already been alluded to, which is how do we make auto-enrolment based on that inertia about long-term saving work with pensions freedom, which is based, of course, on having to make some pretty complex decisions at retirement. Our view would be actually the answer is probably to focus on making the retirement decisions as simple as possible, rather than hoping to turn overnight 10 million people from savers into investors.
Ruth?
Thank you. And it's good to see that there are low levels of opt-out. Have any of you noticed any difference between age, gender, levels of income with the proportions of people that are opting out? Yes.
Yes, we notice a particular age correlation. So our average opt-out rate is 9%, but for people below age 35 it is only 5.7%. And it is highest at the people above 55. We notice a slight gender correlation. Women are slightly more likely to opt out at all age groups than men. I draw two things out of the age thing in particular. I draw an enthusiasm for young people to save in a pension plan. And, I translate that to endorsing the suggestions from the last review that the Minister did to decrease the age of entry down from 22 down to 18. And I worry about the old people that do not join. I think they are people that have probably declined pension membership for many times throughout their career. But actually, if you join a pension scheme shortly before retirement, you get fantastic value for money. out of those contributions. So I'm out there evangelising it and encouraging them to join.
I'd just add to that briefly. The DWP, I think, did some work with HMRC and looked at real-time earnings information, so a kind of very, kind of national level look at this. And what they found was similar. So they found older people more likely to opt out, higher earners more likely to opt out, and men actually more likely to opt out. But they're tiny, you're talking kind of difference between 0.6, 0.7 levels of opt-out. So very marginal differences. And I think I agree with you, Adrian, in terms of it's important to save in later life, but I think some of those judgments might be legitimate where people have already got strong DB savings, maybe they're coasting towards retirement, maybe they're higher end. So I wouldn't read too much into it myself.
Okay. It's interesting that younger people aren't opting out, where they may be in short-term transient jobs, and they may wonder, or one may wonder where they might see that pension in 50 years' time, maybe. There's a huge amount, for young people in particular, there is a lot of amount of complicated paperwork that comes with their auto-enrolment pension. Is there any way that can be simplified so that young people can get a greater understanding of what they're getting? Because whilst inertia might be a good thing in the big scheme of things, young people feeling that they're not making enough money to be able to rent a property, or feeling that their money just disappears, whether it's tax, national insurance, whatever, is not a good thing for them not to be understanding what's happening. How clear do you think the information is that comes to people with their auto-enrolment pension, and could it be made any clearer?
Can I answer that, if I may? We've recently trialled some digital ways of engaging with people, and we recently launched a video benefit statement where there is an animation that shows what the potential income they could get from their contributions, and it's also a nudge to try and encourage members to make use of employer matching contributions as well. So quite a few of our employers offer step-ups if the employee is willing to contribute a bit more, then the employer is willing to match those contributions. And the work that we've done so far has got a very high engagement rate and lots of positive feedback from people, and over a third of people have actually gone through and clicked through and have increased their contributions. So we think the digital and new ways of engaging with people, I think, is the way forward.
Just to add, I think digital will help the digitalisation of pensions. That's something that hopefully in the long-term pensions dashboard will ease. But I do think we have to be honest as well about the fact that auto-enrolment is a defined contribution scheme. Therefore, there isn't certainty about what one is getting. And people aren't stupid, they know that. And therefore, there's, you can do as much as possible in statements to give a projection of where ones might get to. But in the end, that is uncertain. And I just think we have to bear that in mind when we're thinking about this context.
Okay. And
yes, Greg, do you think there's any role for a hybrid scheme then?
I think that's something, of course, Mr. Chair, which the CDC debate is bringing out into the open. The biggest pension scheme in the UK, the University Superannuation Scheme, of course, has moved to a hybrid scheme already, with a DC section for those earning above a certain amount. Their pensionable pay is capped at around 55,000, as I understand, and they moved to DC on any earnings above that. So, I think there's lots of work going on around the world, actually, looking at what an ideal pension system is. But what I would say is that auto-enrolment has been a big success so far. It's brought in 10 million people, or just under, and of course we all say that, but it is a significant thing in itself. And I think we have to proceed with auto-enrolment in a clear-eyed way, because that's part of the success has been it's been signposted the various stages of auto-enrolment. Governments have stuck to those stages. It's allowed providers to plan out their approach to auto-enrolment. So we need to do that while being aware that, of course, other things are going on at the same time, and the possibility of hybrid schemes is one of those things.
Just add very briefly to that, I think on the CDC question, quite a lot of the benefits that one might derive from a CDC scheme can be derived from an element of risk sharing in retirement. So part of what Nest and others have been talking about for a while in terms of default retirement pathways is an element of risk sharing and mortality pooling later in life, so that you income smooth and de-risk your assets as you move towards the kind of the latter years of drawing your pension. So I think there are degrees and degrees of CDC. There's no one kind of definition, and I think we're watching with interest as well what happens in terms of the schemes in the UK that are going to bring it in, and international experience as well. But I think we could immediately derive some of those benefits actually by developing more innovative default retirement pathways as an industry.
Retirement is the phase where potentially I think a hybrid approach has value. Some of the claims made for CDC in the accumulation phase, in our view, are overdone. They can be achieved by the scale which large master trusts are accruing. But given how do you deliver retirement income with some degree of certainty, that's where that hybrid approach has potentially got worth looking at.
No, that's fine.
Really good. I thought I'd given it out to someone.
Give it to me if you like.
It's this you, Heidi. All right.
Good morning.
I'll join in the game.
So just drawing or kind of further a couple of the points we just talked about, the age of people and the whole middle classness and whether lower earners benefit from this. So the DWP looked at how successfully the policy was working as a whole at the end of December and came up with a couple of suggestions. One was to drop the auto-enrolment age from 22 to 18, and one was to take away the earnings threshold totally, which could benefit people who perhaps have lots of little jobs of small amounts. Do any of you have a view as to whether they're the right proposals and whether they should be done swiftly? Perhaps start with Adrian and then Zoe.
Yes, no, I think both of those are good. Our survey work has shown that 2/3 of 18 to 22-year-olds would welcome being automatically enrolled into a pension scheme. And on removing the lower earnings limit and counting pension contributions from the first pound of earnings, I am particularly struck at the difference that would make. So although the headline contribution rate for automatic enrolment today is 8%, nobody gets 8% because there's a bit knocked off the bottom and a bit knocked off the top. The best that anybody gets is somebody who is actually on the top ceiling of 46,000. They get 6.9%. The worst that anybody gets is somebody who's down at the bottom end, at the £10,000 minimum for enrolment. They get just 3.2%. So we rather like the phrase 8 means 8, and we'd like to see the 6,132 gradually phased away. I think it needs to be phased away because it would be a big increase in contributions, and it's not a good idea to put big increases on either the employees or the employers in one go. But I think it's the right thing to do and to get rid of it, and eventually to be counting all earnings from the first pound right up to for pensions.
The age, again, dropping from 22 to 18, you'd support that?
Yes.
Okay.
I agree with what Adrian says. I think the LEL, we would support removing it. It is a big jump. So if you're earning, as I said earlier, £11,000, let's say, it's a big jump. So we need to think about that and how we smooth that and what impact it might have. But we would still support it broadly. The age, though, I just wanted to highlight, it has a big impact for women, right? So a lot of women, those years from 18 to 21 are really critical earning years, especially for women who are going to take a section of time out of the workforce. And so I think from that perspective, particularly, it's interesting. And I'm part of a group called the run by the CII, looking at women's policy in relation to pensions and game changers that we can try and enact to kind of make a real difference to women. So as part of that, as well as supporting those two proposals, we're looking at the levels of the earnings trigger, which currently excludes a lot of women, and also credits for carers potentially. So previously under SERPs and S2P, if you were caring, you'd be credited into a pension. At the moment, we don't do that. It's very difficult, complex, quite difficult political question about how you would do that.
Shouldn't we just give them money?
You could just give them the money. So I mean, it's early stage thinking. There's lots of different ways you could do it. It's a pretty complex thing to do. But at the moment, we're just banking the contribution that carers make to the economy, and we're not giving them anything in second tier savings.
And when they're looking after families, I mean, what's the difference in your mind? Between credits and actual, say, universal credit paying the cash.
You could pay you could pay them cash. It's whether you want systematically to direct that saving into a second tier pension or not, right? So there's lots of different ways that you could recompense people for that caring, and there's lots of different directions you could send the money.
I qualify as a carer,
Yeah.
and I get a credit.
Yep.
What does a credit mean compared with universal credit paying my contributions?
You could do either.
Not be on UC as a carer. You could
But what does credit mean? Who credits what? I mean, pension schemes are about having money, not having credits.
Sorry.
But it would go into the pension scheme at
what
some
I mean
point.
is a sum of money would go from the government into the pension scheme, which is set at a notional level, depending on how much politically we would want to put into that.
Into work, you're then adding to it.
Exactly.
It's sitting there waiting for you.
Yeah.
Used on the logic of this, just because the whole idea of having a single tier state pension was the government said this is enough to get you above the poverty line.
Yeah.
If you want more, save for it, and you can have it and you can keep it, and we won't reduce your other benefits in retirement if you do. Doesn't then trying to re-add a kind of like state-funded second-tier pension completely unravel the whole logic of having a single-tier pension?
Acknowledging this particular thought is simply acknowledging that previously, when we had a second-tier pillar a pension, when we had S2P and SERPs, we got to a position politically where people were comfortable with the idea that caring responsibility should be acknowledged in that, right? And at the moment, we've recreated second-tier saving, and those caring responsibilities are not recognised in that. And I don't have a particular solution. I thought it was just worth raising in the context of women's experience and how they're doing in terms of automatic enrolment and what they're accruing. That is an important...
People you've looked at, do you know? Or is this just something that you're...
It's something that the Ensuring Women's Futures workstream that I'm on is starting to look at, and we will be discussing with DWP, but we haven't... Those conversations are at an early stage.
Something we could ask as a question to the DWP, whether they've thought about it.
Yeah.
You see, I'm still puzzled today because under SERPs and those others, there were credits, but there was never any investment. So you could issue credits to your heart's content, but it made up people's contribution record for eligibility. These are pensions based on assets, and therefore I'm really anxious that people should have their assets, and it should be paid in on time so that their assets accumulate value.
The Society has come up with specific proposals around this a couple of years ago, which suggested cash value being paid by the government on behalf of carers into their automatic enrolment pension. Yeah.
Their contributions, yeah.
So it is a proper contribution, yeah.
So it's only a question of where you put it if they haven't started anything yet.
Greg, you've been immersed in this from this angle, from House Commons, haven't you? Can we bring you in?
Thank you, Mr Chair. I wouldn't claim to be an expert in the welfare system like other people in the room, but I want to try and put this in context. I thought Nigel's point was a really interesting one about what the objective of the single state pension was. The Pensions Commission's perspective, and it of course recommended moving towards a single state pension just a lot more slowly than the coalition government ended doing. Its perspective was that the single state pension should be a basis, but one should be aiming for a replacement rate of around 2/3 of salary at retirement. What happened in recent years was, with governments of different political complexions, I think with pension freedoms in particular, there's emerged this notion that the point of the single state pension is to give you something above poverty, full stop, and then it's up to you what else you want to do. That is a legitimate point of view, of course, but that wasn't the perspective that emerged out of the Pensions Commission, if we go back to that kind of foundational document about putting in place an auto-enrolment approach. So I guess there's competing perspectives on that, but the initial perspective was actually ambition should be 2/3 replacement rate, allowing for different cohorts in society, but broadly we should be ambitious.
So just to wrap up then, we all agree that lowering the threshold earnings and age is a good idea. Anything that the DWP have missed, do you think, that would boost and continue people's enthusiasm for the scheme?
The trigger, so the £10,000 trigger, I mean, if we look at, there's 3.5 million workers who aren't eligible for auto-enrolment because of the trigger, and in essence, in some senses, it's a caring penalty on women, because women are more likely to have more than one job, more likely to have a single job that pays less than the earnings trigger of £10,000. And if we take that view that auto-enrolment is a mass system, and we take the view also that persistency of saving is very important. People earning under 10,000 or multiple jobs, they won't always necessarily be very low earners, but that persistency of saving over time is really important. I would emphasise, I think from a people's pension point of view, that looking again at the trigger and potentially lowering it to the national insurance threshold, that would bring in 750,000 people, and 500,000 of those would be women. So that kind of shows the
instinctive saving, doesn't it? Just it doesn't matter how well you're earning, it's just part of life, just what you do.
And if it happens, if government was to go down that route, it has to be staged and signposted, because that's what's worked really well in auto-enrolment. There's been clarity all the way through about the stages.
Greg, can I confess my ignorance? Because MPs aren't in these schemes, but it's a disadvantage for the schemes, isn't it, that we're not? But if I was in the scheme, would I have to make my own arrangements to pay, or could I get, through my national insurance contribution, the government to take it automatically and pay it for me? So I'd have a habit, but the government would develop the habit for me.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm not quite full.
At the moment, if I was in the construction industry and part of your scheme, do I have to enter into an arrangement with you, or have I set up, so to speak, with the government through national insurance a standing order to pay you?
It's all done through the employer, so a big onus is placed on the employer.
The employer has
to
do it.
It's all through
so
the.
So that when you change employer, you've got to get your new employer.
Yeah, well, it's all done. It's all done by the employer. So, of course, and I think we're going to talk about small pots, potentially. What happens, Frank, why the small pots problem is such a big one going forward is, if you work in the lower end of the labour market, where lots of our members work, change jobs often even other parts of the labour market, but lower end, you change job, you immediately have to have a pot with your new employer's pension provider. So, simply put, now pensions, Nest pensions and people's pensions will have quite a lot of members in common who have a pot with each of us as they've moved through their working life. And that challenge of how does one consolidate? Consolidate those pots is a real challenge. But it's all the employer is the critical factor. They are the buyer of the pension, which of course creates all kinds of problems when we come to thinking about value for money and engagement. The individual beneficiary is not the buyer of the pension. It's not a principal agent market in the way that markets which work better from a profit-making point of view are.
But you could have a system, couldn't it, where your entry was through your employer, but you then had a standing order arrangement with the revenue, that when you changed your employer, you just continued unless you cancelled your standing order.
Into the same pension
Yes, same pension pot. Sorry.
Yeah, except that I suppose you get into commissions, don't you, and which employers using Norwich Union and next one. Yeah. But the dashboard therefore has to put it together.
Nigel?
Danger of being dragged into a debate here rather than asking you questions. But Greg, you talked about the savings habit. Except if I was being a little mischievous, I'd say the reason auto-enrolment works is that people don't really know they're doing it half the time, and so they're not really in a habit at all. It just happens to them. But if I was equally being mischievous, I'd say having a load of pension funds here saying more pension saving is good is perhaps not the most impartial advice we ever get. But are there any groups of people who you think actually are so struggling to make ends meet on a day-to-day basis that actually taking some of their money off them and making them save it for a retirement that's 40 years away, when they'll get a single-tier pension that might actually be more than they're currently earning, actually isn't a very clever thing to do for their own personal finances?
I'll take that one. So absolutely. And it's a really difficult structural policy question, this, right? Because if you want to use inertia and you want to have a system that, by and large brings in the working population, at the edges of that, you're going to catch some people for whom actually the agency of having that money in working life may have been better than saving into the pension, but it's very, very difficult to draw those lines. And that's why the debate around the lower earnings limit and around the age, the earnings trigger of £10,000 is finely balanced and difficult. And as I sort of referenced earlier in my introduction, one of the things that Nest is doing is trialling this rainy day savings account idea, where you automatically save into a pension plus a rainy day account, which gives you some liquidity. So at the same time as building up a pension, you're building up a small liquid savings account that in the event of kind of financial crisis, you can dip into it.
Tax relief being used for that, I think.
Tax relief isn't being used for that. So we're not, at the moment, it's an early stage trial. So we're kind of tacking a savings account onto automatic enrolment. So the savings element is separate to that. So there's a whole, we need to see how those trials go. There would need to be a whole policy debate about whether you systematically make this part of automatic enrolment. But I think the idea of trying to build an element of financial resilience into automaticity of saving is a really interesting one and helps mitigate. I don't think it completely gets you over it, because of course there will be some people who are saving and for whom actually it'd be better for them to have the agency of that cash today.
Any of the other three guys on the panel, are they thinking about resilience saving?
I mean, I think it's worth recognising the difference between the UK system, which is a voluntary system based on a principle that we presume it's in people's interest to save, and a number of other international systems where there is compulsory saving. So we automatically enrol, with the employer's help, all the eligible savers that meet the criteria the government have set, and they can then opt out there at that point, or they can leave at any subsequent pay period that they wish to. They can always unplug themselves from the system and stop. So that very difficult decision that Zoe referred to as to whether for an individual it's right at their time of life to be saving or not is left with the individual to make, but the system works on a presumption that they ought to be saving, so the decision is made for them to save, and then they can back off and unplug if they want to.
I was just thinking that before we got too excited about getting people into a savings habit, actually, the reason why inertia works is that people don't necessarily understand they can opt out or just forget that they ever could, and then they stay in by default. I mean, that's kind of what we were aiming for.
I'd cite what happened last April on that, because last April, when there was a contribution increase, we went through a large communication programme. We wrote to all our members, we gave the employer information to put in payroll, we gave the employer posters and videos to put up in the worksite. So the employees were well informed that there was a contribution increase coming, and then very, very few of them opted out. The numbers leaving increased by just 0.2% a month as we went through April. So because it's inertia, it was taken from their pay packet, and they found that they could afford it, so they didn't withdraw. If it had been the other way around, if we'd written out to people saying, would you like voluntarily to sign up for a contribution increase, then very few would have signed up, because again, the nature of inertia would then have worked against the individual.
Now, does he take your point? Sorry, Colin.
Well, we did a similar exercise to Now Pensions. We had a suite of communications that employers could use with their members. The pensions regulator's communications to employers was very much focused on employer duties and compliance and making sure that you pay what you're supposed to be paying, whereas the communications that we produced for employers to use with members all focused on the benefits of saving, the fact that their employer was going to be increasing their contributions as well as the members having to increase their own contributions, and also reminding them of the government incentive in the form of tax relief as well. And our experience over that period of time, sort of March, April, May, was very similar to Adrian's. It is a very small difference in opt-out rates, and even below our average opt-out rate of 6.2%. I think the opt-out rate around about that period of time was about 4%. So we know that people are still willing to save and willing for their contributions to go up.
Taking your initial question directly, Nigel, of course you're right, there's trade-offs in policy, of course. I think if we reflect on just the challenge which auto-enrolment is seeking to solve, which is really based on the decline of employer contributions into pension saving, then getting the system as universal as possible to make it as simple as possible, and as simple as possible, of course, is a qualified statement, I think is probably very important. But of course, when one takes that approach, there inevitably are issues around the edges or coming more into the centre that emerge. But I think part of the success was really going for a broadly universal approach. And of course, you're right to say again, pension providers think pensions are really important, and 8% isn't enough for significant groups. But of course, that won't be the case for everyone. And I think a big question around contributions is, where does the increased contributions balance come from in terms of employers and individuals? We're going to be sitting at 5% from individuals and 3% from employers. If contributions are to rise, where does that balance sit?
That's an interesting point. Sorry.
The tax relief for higher rate taxpayers, couldn't it?
Well, the People's Pension view is that there should be a flat rate of tax relief, and redefined as a savers bonus to try and increase understanding and awareness of that boost which the government is giving to your saving.
Isn't there an opportunity, Greg, then, sorry, for employers, for people who will approach them to say, I want to pull out, to actually have a discussion with them? And the reason I'm thinking that is when I started in Strathclyde Regional Council, you were automatically in, and you were only allowed out if you were able to demonstrate to the employer that you had other provision.
Mum and Dad were both in the Strathclyde scheme, so I know it very well. One point I would make, Chris, and I guess my colleagues here would agree, is that auto-enrolment has changed pensions fundamentally because it's brought in small employers. So pensions used to be for better off people and big employers. What has happened with the emergence in particular of the three biggest auto-enrolment providers and on a not-for-profit basis is working with very small employers who have never engaged with pensions before. And when you're having micro-employers having to deliver a pension, it changes that conversation. When I think back to the way that my mum and dad's pension in Strathclyde, and my mother's still a Strathclyde pensioner, there's a very different arrangement, and most importantly, it's a defined benefit arrangement, of course, where there is that certainty around what you're getting. So we've got to do more, and getting the communications right is really important. But we've got 85,000 employers as clients. Nest will have a lot more than that.
600,000.
600.
97% SMEs.
So it's a real different environment.
That there's an encouragement if an employee was to say to the employer, I want to pull out of here. You know, to have that discussion of, well, first of all, here are the benefits to you, but do you have other provision? Because if you don't, these are the potential consequences in the future. If we can't
get employers in the long run to really engage and see pensions as part of an important employee benefit, then it just makes the heavy lifting all the heavier.
Switch. I mean, the reason for pension saving is that I've got a good asset in retirement to live off. So I was just looking at the various returns of your funds. I know it's all very early days. So Nest, I think the 3-year annualised return was at 11%. So that's pretty good. People's Pension 9.9%. Legal and General 10.8%. These all seem pretty good annualised returns. Mr. Boulding, now pensions 3.1%. What's gone wrong?
Well, the now pensions return measured over the short term is lower than a lot of the others because our trustees took a decision to currency hedge. They took a view that they did not want to expose the members to currency fluctuations. Over the particular period that you're looking at, we've been through the Brexit vote. The pound has gone down considerably against the dollar and other major international currencies. So over that short term, yes, our members would have been better off if the trustees had decided to expose them to currency fluctuations, which has happened in a number of other funds. But I think over the long term, those things will even out.
So you say I should put my money into the now pension quickly in case the pound strengthens again, or have you bottomed out that risk or something?
Well, interesting it's your employer that decides, where to place investments. And the employer will choose a scheme looking at a number of factors, one of which is investment, a number of which is service to the member, another of which will be service to the employer.
I mean, these returns are somewhere around 10% annualised return. I mean, are these sustainable long-term returns, or have you had a win from currency exposure that actually we shouldn't be thinking you can achieve 10% a year forever? And just looks a bit over the top.
I mean, People's Pension takes a view that going forward, central to our investment approach will be to reduce risk. So equity markets have performed very well, at least until recently. These figures might look a bit different if we updated them since the more recent market falls. But certainly our view is that reducing risk over time is a good thing, and a 9.9% return, history suggests that's not going to be easy to achieve. But reducing risk and reducing that volatility, we would put very high up our agenda, Nigel, and that means diversification. But diversification takes you into a cost argument. So one thing, only speaking for the People's Pension, that our investment approach has done well is keep costs very low. It's a very straightforward, simple, index-based investment approach. No paying of active managers, Frank, to outperform the market. But over the long term, if we want to diversify, how do we get exposure to unlisted assets, infrastructure and things like that, to diversify the investment portfolio, but to keep costs low? That will be the challenge, because these assets are more expensive to invest in. And of course, the Treasury and the government are interested in having funds like the funds represented here today to look at patient capital, investing in late-stage venture capital. And that's a really interesting project the Treasury is undertaking. And we're involved in that, the People's Pension. But one of our questions is, how can that be done in a way where you can access that asset class at a price which doesn't mean you're paying too much for investment?
Do you build your own index, basket of index, or do you ask somebody else to do that for you?
So historically, since 2012, someone else has done it for us. Going forward, we have begun the process of taking that in-house. So just very recently, we've created our first index with an ESG tilt, where companies are being excluded on the basis of various criteria. But it's an ongoing process, Frank. In the initial years of auto-enrolment, we focused on processes and systems and administration, and the investment has gone okay, as those numbers suggest. But long-term reducing risk via these kind of approaches is central to what we're intending to do.
Greg.
Yes.
Really interesting. Yes. Ruth?
Okay, thank you. With particularly younger people being much more transient in their work and in their where they live, there is an increasing risk of unaccessed pension pots. To what extent will the pensions dashboard alleviate that problem?
I'll answer that because we were a party to the prototype to the pensions dashboard that was run on an industry-wide basis in 2017. And it is able for an individual to turn up with a dashboard and to make an inquiry of the databases of all the pension schemes in the land. And on the prototype, when that individual turned up and made an inquiry of our pension, then it would return the answer to him. So I think the pension dashboard is a considerably advanced tool that will help to alleviate this problem of unclaimed pension pots, because when people turn up with their identity of name, national insurance number, date of birth, then an automatic search can be made. And yes, they may well have forgotten about a period of employment or not remembered who the name of that pension scheme was some years ago. The dashboard will have the capability of finding that on their behalf and drawing it to their attention.
Okay. We saw the government put on hold the proposals for automatic pot matching to try and consolidate some of those smaller pots. We've got no new proposals in place at the moment. Does any more need to be done on that?
I think the dashboard will go quite a long way to help people reconnect with those pots and to be able to sort of virtually consolidate them, if you like. I know when the pot follows member approach was being considered by the DWP, one other option was an aggregator scheme or a virtual aggregator scheme. Now the dashboard is essentially a virtual aggregator, which may solve the problem for people to engage, but it wouldn't necessarily encourage them to move things around. But I think we need to take it in stages. But I think one of the key things that the dashboard needs to deliver is full coverage across all of the pension schemes, be it DB, DC, public sector, private sector, so that everybody is guaranteed that they will be able to see all of their pots at some stage in one place. I think if there are schemes that were let off having to provide data and people couldn't find things, I think that would damage the potential that the dashboard could deliver. So we're very supportive of what the DWP is doing and the momentum that it's gaining at the moment. But I think that's a first step. I think longer term, once you've got something there and people have reconnected with their pots, I think there's more work that could be done on possible consolidation later on. But I think we need to have the dashboard there, reconnect people with their pots first, and then start working on phase 2, if you like.
Can I just take really interesting about aggregators, because that was discussed in the 2010 Parliament quite a lot. There was differing views. There was a pot follows member view which the government favoured and the opposition at the time favoured an aggregator approach. If we think about dashboard, all the conversation about dashboard is about increasing awareness amongst individuals. Awareness and engagement might be different things, of course, but increasing in the first instance awareness. I think we have to be clear about dashboard that will be a very good thing, even increasing awareness. But there are big questions about the governance of dashboard and making sure that any dashboard operator, in our view, should have a legal duty to have to put the interests of users first, a bit similar to the fiduciary duty which we all operate under. So we think that legal duty should be brought in by the government. On the automaticity, that takes us from a view of dashboard as something just for individuals to use for awareness, to how can it drive providers via legislation to create automatic consolidation. So the Australian system has that, and it's done via the tax office. And if a pot is under a certain amount, and it's defined as a stranded or lost pot, i.e. when you send out a communication, you can't find the individual, it immediately has to go to the Australian tax office, and it's their job to reunite that pot via the unique tax reference number with the pot holder. Dashboard can do something similar, but that will need legislation at some stage to place duties on providers to undertake that consolidation, or via aggregator approach. But it's critical. Think of a customer journey at the moment. We're hurtling towards, a few years down the line, auto-enrolment. Someone might have 8 pots, 8 different providers over time. They're due to get 8 letters a year from different providers with different amounts. Actually, they might only get 4 or 5 because they haven't updated their home address with all the different providers. And so they don't have all the information, and they've got a multitude of information therein. That's just not going to enable people to have that awareness, never mind engagement, about taking an action. The awareness of what one has, critical first step dashboard, what have I got and where is it? And then down the line, as others have suggested, how do we get that automatic process in place to consolidate auto-enrolment pots?
Yeah, whilst the government terminated the programme to automatically transfer stranded pots, they did give our trustees a power to make bulk transfers without member consent. And something that our trustees are particularly interested in is trying to analyse where we have particular groups of members that have ceased contributing to now pensions, but are contributing to another pension scheme, whether we can have a one-on-one dialogue with that other pension scheme and transfer those members, having forewarned them that it was going to happen if they didn't opt out, but transfer them in bulk to a scheme where they are now contributing. And we have the power within the legislation to do that already, and it's something our trustees are interested in. It's something I think we could see a lot more of once we've gone through the other side of Master Trust authorisation, and the trustees would then draw great comfort from knowing they were transferring them to an authorised pension scheme.
Do you want members back in return, Adrian?
We would be very happy if members came back the other way. I mean, it wouldn't be appropriate to make that a condition of the deal, But we would be very happy to work with the scheme to say, well, you've probably got the reverse problem. You've probably got people that are currently contributing to now pensions because they've changed jobs, but they are no longer contributing to us. So we would happily take a sort of a swap, a prisoner exchange, if you like.
Doing this because it's in the interest of the consumer,
Exactly my question.
or is it because it will minimise your costs?
No, can I clear that one?
Yeah.
We're doing this because we are very concerned that people that leave small pots behind are a drain on the system. And therefore we would like to do that. Well, what I mean is they are a drag on the system because they have a number of small pots around the place, each of which is incurring costs. Now, in the particular case of now pensions...
Costs for who?
Well, they're incurring in the cost of now pensions, they're incurring costs for the member. The people that set up now pensions originally in 2011 decided they did not want a cross-subsidy between the members with the smallest pots and the members with the largest pot. So we charge members separately for fund management and for servicing. So if they've left a small pot behind, then they are being charged for servicing, and we encourage them to transfer. And for those that haven't taken that hint, we actually think that a system of bulk transfer would enable us to move them in their interests, not our interests, in their interests, to the place where they are now making their contributions.
Just to add to, I think, this is something we've been discussing as a group of Master Trusts for quite a long time, through the PLSA and other routes. And I think, we've always come at it from Nest very much from a consumer perspective. Could this be one of the solutions to the small pot problem? When you look at, the potentially consolidating market as a result of Master Trust authorisation, so potentially you end up in a few years' time with actually a smaller number of large schemes operating together. At Nest, we have you have a pot for life, so if you flow in and out of Nest at various stages, you're just accumulating one pot, which makes it simpler in itself, and I think it would be good for other schemes to think about doing that as well. But I think, when in a world where, there's 5 or 6, let's say, very big scale master trusts operating out there, you might have pots with 4 of them, but hopefully they'd all be fairly substantial. And if we can find ways of solving that micro pot issue and have the dashboard on top, we've come some way along the road to making things better for the consumer.
What incentive is there for trusts or pension schemes to try to reunite lost pension schemes with their owners, or with a new pension that they're contributing to? And is it going to happen across the board, or is it something that government will need to take a little more action on?
That from a people's pension point of view, and wrapping it in Frank's question about in whose interest, same question, is this done? I think the structure of the organisation is very important. So if you take the People's Pension, it's a not-for-profit organisation. Clearly, it's more efficient to have small pots consolidated from the view of running the pension scheme. It should reduce costs. But in our not-for-profit structure, that means those reduced costs go back to the members in one way or another. So we currently charge 50 basis points flat fee for everyone, which was a big advance in the market, half of 1% for everything. We would like over time to reduce that further for our members, and if one can make the system more efficient by reducing the number of small pots that we administer, that should mean over time, given our structure, because profit can't be distributed to shareholders, that should mean lower charges and or better services for our membership.
Reduce costs by taking the investments in-house, don't you, Greg?
Yes, and that investment piece is a very interesting issue. What I would say, Frank, is it's possible you could take the investments in-house and that reduces costs, but at the same time, as you try and diversify your portfolio, you're actually having to access more expensive asset classes. So you might be doing two things at the same time which are in tension. Where, for example, your overall investment budget might stay the same because you're buying more expensive.
And what happens to these unaccessed pension pots at the end of the day? Where do they go? They're not in little cells in Gringotts Bank underground somewhere. What happens to them after what period?
With us, they just stay in the scheme until we're able to find somebody to reunite them. So If we have lost touch with people, we do regular exercises where we trace their whereabouts sort of every 6 months, every 12 months, and eventually somebody will reconnect. There will come a time when you think somebody's potentially too old, so they may have deceased, in which case we're doing some work on looking into what we could call dormant assets and what we could do with those dormant assets. But at the moment, those are retained within the scheme. I think our oldest customer is about 84, 85 or something like that. So they're not old enough yet for us to start thinking that this is a real issue for us, but it's certainly something that we're mindful of.
But Colin, when it comes up, let's imagine I'm coming up to retirement age, I'd always imagined if I had all these pensions pot, it would be like being in our store, local store, where you had those very old-fashioned things you put money in and screwed it on and it all went to the cashier. Is that what happens as I reach retirement? These different pension pots all get in touch with me with my assets to say, what do you want?
Yeah, that's exactly right. All pension schemes have legal duties to start sending what we call wake-up packs to people. The timing, the FCA is looking at the timing of these at the moment because they come out very close to when your normal retirement date would be. It's about 4 months before you reach that point. But there's a lot of research that shows that that's probably not early enough. So the Financial Conduct Authority is working on some proposals at the moment to start issuing those kind of communications from age 50 onwards, to start people thinking about the transition from the savings phase to the spending phase. So yes, there will be a given point where you will be bombarded with communications from all of your pension schemes.
More of these packs are going to start bombarding.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we talked a lot about people having bits and pieces all over the place, and auto-enrolment, of course, isn't going to stop that. If anything, it might mean that they have more. How much do you think, or how successful do you think auto-enrolment has been in making people, they're definitely more aware of pensions, I think, probably than they were, but ownership, that it's my thing that I'm leaving behind when I move company, and I need to think about whether that is the best deal or whether I should be shopping around. Has the awareness reached that level with people, or is it still a bit of a thing that's done to them, if that makes sense?
Shall I start on that? So I think, there's some really encouraging indications from work we do through a consumer tracker survey, which is suggesting that there's a kind of normalisation in feeling like pensions is a normal thing to be doing amongst our the DC membership. So figures around questions like, pension is the right place to save, and it's a normal thing for people like me to save, and a pension have kind of doubled over the last 3 or 4 years. That's really encouraging. I think, we have to be honest with ourselves that doesn't mean that people are engaging and starting to make active choices. And I think one of the kind of hazards we need to be alive to is that in making decisions to, for instance, consolidate one's pot, so you might look at the dashboard and say, oh gosh, I'll just stick it all in L&G or something because it's simpler. And this is not a comment on L&G, it's a bad example, is that people are highly price insensitive, right? They don't understand what pensions charges and what value for money means. It goes a little bit back to, Greg's point about, the need to diversify and spend a bit more on investment in order to get the right return. So you might have a slightly higher charge, but actually, you're getting better results. It's a really complex area to try and express value for money. So I think, to answer your question more directly, I think people, in our experience, our members aren't engaging at that level of sophistication yet. Tech and the dashboard might make them engage more, and I think when they do that, we need to make sure there's really strong consumer protections to make sure they're not making the wrong choices. And that's one of the reasons why I agree with Greg and others that the dashboard needs to be a single public dashboard with very strong consumer protection and principles built around it.
I would be the sort of person just for tidiness. If I could see all those things, I'll just shove them all in one. It's just easier.
Apps that can persuade you to do that, and you don't see what's underlying that.
Do you as companies analyse your costs and returns and compare them against other companies and see how you might improve your performance?
Yes. We do. I mean, it's a mix, because you have the costs and charges that are placed directly on members through the contribution charge and the AMC in this case, and then there's investment costs, which is a whole other area. And like Greg says, we're probably a little bit further down that path actually that you're grappling with, because we've always taken a very sort of more active approach to investment, sometimes spent more than other schemes in order to do that. Sorry.
I mean, one exercise is, do we charge the least?
Yeah.
But as Greg was pointing out, and other members were, it's the returns which are also important.
Right.
Do you actually do you internally consider regularly what your costs and what the rate your returns are, as opposed to all other companies, and whether you should improve your performance?
I wouldn't say we've got a formal process to do that in Nest, but I would say that we all, I think, at a kind of management level, have an awareness of what other schemes' costs and charges are and returns are, and are comfortable where we stand within that. I do. Sorry.
Yes, it's a matter that the trustees take very seriously in terms of value for money, which is looking, at what is it that the members get and what is it that the members are being charged in order to get that.
And other companies.
Yes. So we employ external firms to do the benchmarking for us. Competition law would prevent us sort of cozying up to another master trust and saying, well, what are your internal costs? Yes. How much are you charging your members? But we can use an external firm to benchmark ourselves against others in the marketplace.
You don't have to cosy up to them. You know what they charge because it's published, isn't it?
Well, we know their published charge information. We don't know what internal costs they are incurring.
There's also
coming out the pot, though.
There's also, Frank, this really interesting area, which is we just charge, as things stand, every employer who's the buyer of the pension is charged the same, small or big, the same, and probably. Some providers do bespoke pricing, and that was the traditional way that pension was done, where the price depends on the size of the scheme, how soon it becomes profitable, so it can be quite difficult to compare. Some schemes are utterly transparent just because they've got a single charging structure like us. Everyone pays the same. Others, you actually don't know, so it can be hard to do a comparison. Where we've been looking is actually, in an informal way rather than a formal process at this stage, is at the Australian market, which is a very similar system, the most similar system to the UK, and has now been doing DC for 25 years. It's compulsory rather than semi-compulsory like ours, very similar system, and looking at the returns there versus the costs. And it's quite striking because there the costs are higher often, but the returns have been very good over the long term, particularly in the not-for-profit space. So we're trying to understand why that is and what are the similarities and differences.
Could I just, on this point, could I ask you to give us that information? And if you don't, might you tell us why you won't? Is that all right? Thanks. Nigel?
The reason why this is important, the reason why I asked about your returns is that when you're marketing to employers, what are you offering them? Are you offering them the pension that gives the best return for their employees? Or are you offering stuff that's convenient for the employer? So I don't want to pick on you, Mr. McClymont, but I thought I'd have a quick check on your website, and you've got 9 reasons to recommend the People's Pension. Do you happen to know what those 9 reasons are?
I would fail that test comprehensively.
An award-winning automatic enrolment solution. People's Pension has a de facto 5-star rating. I'm sure that's very important. A great contact centre. Clear communications, that's very important. Seamless transfer of employee data. Expertise in dealing with complex payrolls. A simple transfer process. A management charge of just 0.5%. An independent trustee board with strong governance. And the first master trust to obtain independent assurance of scheme quality. Not one of those 9 reasons why an employer should choose your pension is actually we invest the money quite well and we'll give your staff a good pension. I mean, it's...
The good news is that our returns suggest that we do that. I think you're...
But that's not what you're asking the employer. What you're saying to the employer is, come with us because we're cheap and it'll be easy for you, not because actually it might be a bit harder and maybe not quite as cheap, but actually your employees will get a far better pension from this. That isn't even one of the 9. It ranks even below the call centre.
Well, I think the call centre does... So I take your point, and it's a very good point. I think those 9 reasons do matter a lot. What I would say is that if we think about auto-enrolment, it only began in 2012. And the fundamental thing in auto-enrolment in the early stage is to get those contributions processed efficiently. So we now have more than 1 million employers processing contributions via providers for nearly 10 million people. Getting that right was the critical first step. Over time, as the Australian system suggests, after 25 years, in Australia, all the talk now, Nigel, is about net returns. All the talk in Australia after 25 years is about net returns. I would anticipate in the UK, we're in year 7, the fact that we're having this discussion about investment, which I wonder if we would have had when I was around these buildings, we weren't talking at all about investment in auto-enrolment. As the pots grow, as the assets grow, inevitably there will be more focus on investment. But you're right to say the focus so far has been on process systems and administration, generally speaking.
Part of what Greg said earlier, that this auto-enrolment, or maybe it wasn't Greg, actually changed the scene. That employers who never thought they were going to be agents for pensions are now agents for pensions. And if they thought that, they'd be looking, oh my God, I want something simple, rather than what's the return for my employees. That might, I'm not trying to excuse anything, but that, if you're trying to make this very big jump, which auto-enrolment did, and I was an employer, and frightened about, God, I'd only be breaking the law, I think I'd be looking for something simple. And that was Nest's great attraction, wasn't it?
I think that's, it's a kind of sign of a maturing policy that we're having this debate, isn't it? Because, a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, before we went through the big staging of employers, the big worry was, how can you get all these thousands and thousands of employers on board? Is it possible? Is it going to happen? Is Nest going to fall over? Others going to fall over? We were at the peak of staging, enrolling thousands of employers a day because we had this kind of straight-through processing system. And we've also got this thing called Nest Connect, which means that if you're a small employer, you can use an intermediary or an IFA to connect with Nest rather than having to do it yourself. And it's been really, really successful. Next question, how do we enable consumers, once they start to build a pot up, to engage with where their employer has chosen to put their assets and to make good decisions about where they should be kind of longer term or at least for retirement. So I think,
It's that point about the buyer is the employer. So if I think about our trustees, they will be thinking deeply about the investment approach of the scheme, and that's probably reflected in our performance so far. But that tension, the buyer is the employer, the beneficiary is the individual. That inevitably creates, some complexity.
Advisors for your scheme, are you building up your own, in a sense, leadership team, or do you rely on the big 4 accountancy firms to advise you?
In terms, Chair,
what you should be doing on investment, how you should choose, and so on.
So we have an investment consultant who isn't from one of the big 4. I don't believe we have an investment committee, which is a committee of the trustee board, and over time we're building up our internal investment team under the leadership of our CIO.
But the big 4 haven't nosed their way in yet.
So I couldn't say categorically, but our investment consultant certainly is not from that.
Before?
No, we use a specialised investment consultant, Reddington. They specialise in investments in the pensions marketplace, and they provide investment advice to our trustees.
We don't use any of the big 4 either. We have a small advisory firm.
Yeah, we are increasingly bringing things in-house. So
that's not the question.
No.
Do you use any of the big 4 now?
Not systematically, to my knowledge, no.
All right, Heidi.
Definitive answer.
This is just Frank's pet topic. I don't think he noticed. So just to wrap up then, is it a fair description that people's knowledge and sense of ownership is maturing, and probably auto-enrolment has maybe helped a little bit with that by just pensions becoming commonplace language, but we're not yet at a stage where people are owning it and thinking and actively choosing something different? Is there anything, do you think that will naturally come with time and with the pensions dashboard, or do you think there's anything more proactive that government need to do to help people make sure they're doing, they're making the very best investment decisions?
I think there's still a long way to go with getting people to engage in making their own investment decisions. I mean, overwhelmingly, the vast majority of our members are invested in the default fund, but we do have some very engaged employers as well that are also sort of very active in coming up with investment solutions for their employees. So we have the concept of what we call our scheme default, which is the one that you very kindly articulated those performance numbers on for us. But we also allow employers to, if they take their own investment advice, to have bespoke investment solutions for their employees. Which is designed very much around the close knowledge that the employer has with their employees and their beliefs and their behaviours. So we're able to tailor different default solutions for different workforces. But yes, it is still a default solution. There is the small minority of people that do choose their own investments. So I think there is some work that still needs to be done to engage people in that regard.
I think it's worth remembering that the auto-enrolment programme is very young. We only started in 2012. It was only last year that the last of the employers came around and was enrolled. Up until last April, it was only contributions of 1% from employer and 1% from employee. So our average pot size, because we are a pure automatic enrolment only scheme, our average pot size is just £500 per member. So they haven't yet got a huge sum of money on which they might feel, that they want to start taking some different investment decisions and things. But I think over time, as those funds build up, then we will see greater levels of member engagement.
And our average pot is just £1,200, so bigger but not huge. Can I guess, make the point we said about auto-enrolment at the beginning, or at least I said that it goes with the grain of human nature around long-term saving. It harnesses inertia. We want people to take ownership, but what do we mean by that? Do we think it's feasible that on a mass basis people will become their own chief investment officer? I certainly don't want anyone. I don't want to have to make decisions about my pension in terms of investing it myself. I think we need to be realistic in terms of the policy about this. I mentioned Australia again because it's the most similar. 25 years down the line, the pots there are significant because it's been a compulsory system with a higher contribution rate for 25 years. There is more awareness than here, but still, in the scheme of things, very, very low awareness. There's some evidence if people get a pot equivalent to 1 year's salary, they take more interest, but more interest relative to what? Relative to probably no awareness or very little awareness. And of course, we have to confront this because of pension freedoms in particular. How do we balance the inertia and the savings phase with making decisions in the retirement phase? Our answer, we think, is, at least in the short to medium term, to try and make the retirement phase the choices as simple as possible for our members, rather than trying to climb Everest by turning millions of individual members who aren't engaged with their savings into highly engaged people. That's our feel for it.
Right. Zoe, I think you
I echo all of that, and I was going to say something very similar. I think we just need to guard against this idea that we've got them in their saving and now we're going to wake them up and they're all going to start making decisions. I think we have to be really honest with ourselves about the weight of evidence that shows that people can't handle these.
The decision they like to make is take it out, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
The idea they're going to, you're on universal credit, no money comes, you've got
Right.
500 quid in your pension pot. If you were free, you'd take it.
And that's part of the interest in sidecar, right? So when we start to allow them to build up some liquid savings, what do they do with that, and how frequently do they tap in? But I think, I worked before this on pension-wise and sat through countless guidance appointments in which people come out more confused than they go in, and that's not a comment on the guidance, that's a comment on the system. It's really complicated.
Against this political correctness about, in a sense, got ownership. One day you will have ownership, but you haven't got it now.
Yeah.
Have you?
Derek? When you need it.
So if you if we take a bit of an average, so someone on an average income who started at the beginning of the scheme in 2012, when they retire, and obviously I guess one of the questions is when that might be, because the dates seem to be a bit fluid, will they actually have a pension that will give them a comfortable life under auto-enrolment?
It helps is the answer. If you go back to the work that the Pensions Commission did that set the original 8% level for this, and they reckon that your typical worker would end up with a pension not of 2/3, which is what the great final salary era used to do, but a pension of about 50%, made up of 1/3 of their salary coming through the state pension, and about another 6 coming from the automatic enrolment at the minimum levels. To get them up to the 2/3, they'll need to pay more in. And that might be voluntary contributions, or it might be the government deciding that the 8% of qualifying earnings is not enough and needs to be increased either by raising the 8 or by expanding the qualifying earnings, so 8 means 8.
That's really helpful. So we've talked a lot this morning already about how people how well they're engaged, who's actually buying the pension, who owns it, do they feel like they own it. When you send out your annual letters, I think that Greg said that that's what happens. Does the letter just advise them, and they might receive, as you're suggesting in time, 8 different letters? Does it advise them just on what's there, or does it give any advice about what they might need to do to deliver a comfortable pension?
We will send them a projection that shows what the pension will deliver at their chosen retirement age, assuming they carry on contributing at the same level. And they can go on our member site and engage with us and look at the contribution calculators and see, well, if I put in another £10 a month, you know, what would that do? Would that improve things for me or not?
It's interesting, and I'll go back a little bit. So I come from the construction trade, and I completely understand the example that Greg was saying, where you tended to move about a bit. So you end up with lots of different pots. Without being unfriendly to my old sector, we were not really engaged in pensions. We used to get the old brown envelopes and just enjoyed that every weekend. But what you're actually is auto-enrolment effectively creating an environment for people that actually may never really engage fully in this, where they will just wait until they retire and see what's there, and it might not be enough. Is there more to be done to actually help people to? There'll be a group of people, I guess, that will always live like that. They'll just wait until it's probably too late, which is why I guess we introduced it in the first place.
I think I'd say that there is a danger that people anchor to whatever level you set auto-enroll, the contributions at, right? So if government says it's 8%, people, a significant number of people think, okay, well, I'm going to be fine. They've said it's 8%, I'm saving, it's all going to be fine, and then will they get there and realise actually it's not a huge amount of money, which takes you to the discussion about should contributions levels go up, and also what constitutes a comfortable retirement. I mean, there are various things going on, and I think there will continue to be various things going on to try and improve engagement, right? So we do a similar thing to Adrian, but the problem is you've got 8 letters to compare against, and so the dashboard potentially will help. So you've got your aggregate figure, and you can put that into a tool and work out how much more that you need to save. But it is a really difficult, question of how you get people to make those judgments. There's also a piece of work going on by the PLSA about retirement income targets, which is a similar system to they have in Australia, where they have a kind of definition of a very comfortable lifestyle, a kind of medium style lifestyle, and a kind of basic one, as a way of trying to get people to anchor and realise, okay, I'm heading for the basic one, I might want the middle one, what's the difference? So that could be really positive, it's early stages. So there's a lot of thinking going on around this. I think the issue is that it will only be a subsection of people who will ever engage with this stuff. So, yeah.
Really good question. I think in that context, assuming that there is a group of the population like that, then it becomes an asset ownership policy. So it is building up assets for parts of the population where those assets, when they crystallise, to take Frank's point, and they become owners of it, they have some sort of buffer, some assets that they give them a bit more freedom, is the way I would think about it for that group of people.
The only duty of government is to ensure that people have got an income in retirement which takes them off means-tested assistance. And isn't it your job to get them to save more on top of that? Not government's job. In effect, giving you the powers of taxation, making people save.
Really our job to get people saving at the right level, which might not be higher, but is the right level for them. Yeah.
Well, we are created as an automatic enrolment master trust, so our predominant responsibility is to assist employers in discharging the statutory duties that Parliament has set them, which included making sure people pay at the statutory contribution rate. So we see that as our predominant job. We are keen to encourage members to pay more, but actually we see our predominant responsibility as enabling those employers who have come to us to discharge their statutory duties completely.
You've all been talking about this 2/3 of previous earnings. That's your job, isn't it? Our job in Parliament in setting rates is to ensure that people are free of falling back onto means-tested assistance, isn't it? You just want us to do all the hard work for you, don't you?
We've already done a lot of work. It goes back to one of the points I made earlier about the digital statements, which try and encourage people to make more use of employer matching contributions, which has been very successful. There was also, we also think that employers have quite a big part to play in this as well, both in the additional incentives that they could potentially offer. I mean, obviously the appetite's going to differ depending on the size of the employer and how much money they've got to be able to do that kind of thing. But there was some research that was carried out on behalf of independent governance committees about a year and a half ago now, which was trying to understand areas where members placed the most value. Good returns, unsurprisingly, came out very highly, but also that their employer was paying in as much as the employee, so 50-50 matching contributions. Now, whether that's something that the government needs to make as standard, or whether more employers should be encouraged to do that, you know, there was a very strong message coming from scheme members that that's where they saw the good value. So what we do at Legal & General is where an employer is offering that matching contribution, we're engaging with them through these video statements to try and get them to pay more, which has been very successful.
Of course, one of the answers to my question is it pushes up costs if you've got that function, rather than Parliament just legislating that people have just got to do as they're told.
There are ways to deliver those messages that are less costly than others. Sending stuff through the post is very costly, but if once you've bought the underlying technology for digital services, the ongoing delivery of those communications is a lot cheaper than having to send a statement through the post that a lot of people probably aren't really opening.
Thank you. I want to turn now to looking at the impact of auto-enrolment on employers, and particularly small and micro employers. We've seen a large increase in the number and the amount of the fines being levied over the last year, and I think in the year to September around 36,000 firms had an average of £1,172 fine, which I think were largely on smaller businesses. Do you think that's proportionate to what small employers get out of an auto-enrolment scheme? Do you want to start, Zoe, as you've principally Nest has got so many micro-employers?
I mean, I wouldn't comment explicitly on the level of the fine. I think it's a question for government. I think broadly employer compliance has been very strong. You know, we welcome the regulator intervening where people aren't complying, but it hasn't been a major issue, and it's been less of an issue than I think people anticipated. I think obviously, you know, a lot of small employers have found it a kind of a big transition to make, to start to engage in pensions and to, you know, get the systems running. But by and large, I think because large schemes like ours have created systems that make it easy for them to process their employees, I think things are running well. So no specific comment on the level of those fines, if that was the question. Do any of you see more issues of fines? I don't know do you see where employers are fined, and if those are more amongst the smaller employers than the larger ones?
It has been very much amongst the smaller employers, and the recent fines are particularly because it has been smaller employers that have been going through the staging duties. And I think the fines almost exclusively relate to employers that did not wake up to the fact they had a job to do here. They now had a statutory duty to take their employees and automatically enrol them into a pension scheme. We're obviously through all that staging now, and there is a widespread compliance culture amongst employers of this. What we're seeing today, of course, is new employers coming to market, new firms that are being set up. And we take on about 150 new employers every month that have started their business up from scratch, created a new business, and cottoned on to the message that they need to have a pension scheme. As soon as they start hiring employees and paying tax, then they get a notice from the pensions regulator, because they're hooked into HMRC for the information, reminding them that they have this duty, they need to go on and do it. They go to the marketplace, they choose a pension scheme, and 150 a month of them choose now pensions.
Derek said earlier, Adrian, do you, if I'm the employer, it's all new to me, I think I've done my minimum, and I'm not making payments, do you chase me for those payments?
Yes. Yes, as soon as you've signed up to Now Pensions, we know whether you're a weekly, 4-weekly or monthly payroll employer, and we will expect to see a return from you on every payroll period. So if you're paying weekly...
How many times would you chase me if I didn't make those returns?
We will chase you if you don't make those returns. I believe it's 3. I'd have to come back and confirm exactly on that. We've chased you a number of times, and when that number is exceeded, we then hook into the regulator and tell the regulator that we've endeavoured to chase you, but you're not responding.
So you then actually report them for investigation? Yes. Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, there's an automatic duty on all pension providers to report unpaid contributions if they remain unpaid after 90 days. Now, we'll chase people 3 times, and we do it in different stages. So the first contact would be with the employer after the first 30 days. If we haven't heard from them after the next 30 days, we then start engaging with the scheme members to make them aware that their employer hasn't paid. And then ultimately, if we still haven't had any response after the end of the 90 days, we'll report them to the regulator.
Do you know when people are making returns for people's income, and it looks as though they're not paying the minimum wage, does the revenue write to them and say, can you check whether you're paying the minimum wage?
Yes, thank you. So in your experience, it's employers not engaging with or not setting up an auto-enrolment scheme that's been the cause of the fines, or is it ongoing compliance? Because presumably if they haven't set one up, you won't know about it because they won't have set one of your schemes up.
It can be different things, Ruth. So it can be, as you suggest, not setting up a scheme. It can also be not providing information when requested by the regulator. It can be, in the case of more seriously, contributions not being collected or invested on time. I think it can be a variety of issues. The latter would be probably quite significant issue, but I think it can be, a variety of issues. And I guess if we put ourselves in very small employers' shoes, lots and lots of people work for very small employers. Therefore, if we want auto-enrolment to be a mass system, then the smallest employers have to be in, and we would take the view that's the right decision. But it is a challenge, for small employers who've got no experience of pensions whatsoever to get this right. My own perspective would be that actually it's proceeded quite successfully, given those challenges. It remains a law-abiding country. Employers want to abide by the law, and with the help from providers and accountants, my sense is that it's worked reasonably well.
We were expecting...
My own experience of setting up an auto-enrolment scheme for a very micro business was that the accountancy fees were £35 a month that would have been charged, and actually the pension contributions weren't a lot more than £35 a month. They were usually about £50 a month. So it just seemed disproportionate, seeing as it was actually quite a big cost on a small not-for-profit business anyway, to pay accountancy fees. So you are then trying to juggle, as a small business, just one other thing in the many other things that you have to do. And the fines can seem, certainly over £1,000 a year is going to be make or break for some businesses, particularly as to whether they take on staff above the level of auto-enrolment. Do you think that's an issue?
They should not need to incur fines because they get good information from the regulator and they get good information from pension providers. And the regulator operates a system of increasing fines. So the initial fine the regulator makes on a firm which is non-compliant is very low. And they say in that fine, if you don't pay that fine and get yourself compliant, the next fine is going to be rather bigger. And eventually, yes, they realise that it will be a threat to their business to pay the fines rather than to comply with the law. So they comply with the law.
But that escalates daily, doesn't it? So it's a pretty quick escalation.
At the end of the process, it begins to escalate daily. Yes, yes. I mean, you do not want to get down to that far end of the process.
We were anticipating that there could have been an increased number of employers not paying the increased contributions in April last year. So we'd implemented processes to spot it at a very early stage, and because we thought that there was going to be more than we would usually see that might be late on occasions, we had to really sort of scale up our processes in case we had hundreds of employers that we all had to engage with and ultimately report to the regulator. But we were very surprised that I think we only had about 4 that we had to investigate in the end. I mean, we don't have as many employers as some of my colleagues here, but it was a very small number of employers that actually didn't pay on time and actually went through the full 90 days before we had to engage with the regulator. So that was quite encouraging.
Thank you. As a committee, we often witness, or sometimes witness, firms going into administration and other companies circling around to try and pick the best bits out, often the owners of the firm itself. We've got a series of master trusts being wound up. Do you do the similar thing, going nosing around, seeing whether you should actually make a bid to take over the business or not?
We're not actively seeking that out, but if any master trust that's looking to exit the market was to approach us, then we would certainly have conversations with them.
Is it the pensions regulator? Who decides who's going to get those poor, stranded, orphaned contributors?
It's up to the trustees of the failed master trust to go and find somewhere to transfer the members' assets to, and also the employers to maintain their duties. Employers are free to make their own choice as well, but it's the existing master trust's responsibility to allow for that transition and that continuity.
How many master trusts have you taken, who've gone belly up, you've taken over?
Legal and General haven't taken any, but Smart Pensions, who we have a small stake in, are working with 3 or 4 master trusts at the moment to take those on.
We're not in the market of absorbing other master trusts, Frank.
We're not actively looking either, and we haven't taken any on so far.
People's Pension absorbed one in 2018, one master trust with assets of just under £20 million, Frank, and we're open-minded going forward. But your question is a very good one because it doesn't lie with the regulator, and therefore you have to find a way to meet the demands of the trustees and sometimes trustee owners of these master trusts.
Sure, I can see that.
And as a not-for-profit, we don't have a blank chequebook. You know, it's you have to find a way to make it. Our trustees will only proceed if it's in the interests of our membership as a whole.
Proper, isn't it? Not in the of the previous trustees, yeah. Steve.
Yeah, I want to just quickly turn to the self-employed, and I really just want to ask, I mean, can we create an auto-enrolment system that works for the self-employed?
I would say that if you look at auto-enrolment and what would you need to copy to make it as successful for self-employed as it has been for employees, you need to copy 3 things. You need to copy inertia, so it happens automatically. You need to copy the fact that the money is taken from pay before the member has got their hands on it, and you need to copy the fact that it doesn't feel like a tax, because the way it works is your employer sends it to a private sector pension provider, not to government. There is no easy way to do that at the moment for the self-employed. But if you look at Matthew Taylor's work on the self-employed, he has painted a future vision of a cashless self-employed society. where self-employed people would invoice and receive payment through apps. You'd pay your gardener using your mobile telephone. If you had that system, then you could apply my three principles of saying through that app you could use inertia to deduct the money before it's reached the individual and send it to a private sector provider so it doesn't feel like a tax. So I think for the future, technology will get us there. In terms of the way self-employed people work today, you can't translate those three principles across at the moment.
How far away is that future that you're talking about?
I think the technology is almost there. I think the issue is whether the HMRC and the legislation will push it that way. And again, to borrow one of Matthew Taylor's analogies, in the scrap metal world, government pushed that industry that way and said you can't do a cash transaction to buy lumps of scrap metal anymore. You do that in a cashless way. So if the self-employed were pushed into a cashless society, that's when this sort of thing could happen. It could, from a technology point of view, happen quite quickly.
These ideas that the government have floated, I think Richard Harrington, when he was briefly at Works and Pensions, suggested that he was interested in a tax return approach, and I think Stephen Webb wanted to increase Class 4 national insurance contributions. I mean, are they feasible, or are they ideas that have gone by the board now?
The construction in particular is the heritage of our organisation. We think it's hard to see any way to do it effectively that doesn't involve tax return. We have in the past tried as a pilot basis just in our own organisation ways to bring construction self-employed on board, and our conclusion was it's hard to see a way to do it that doesn't involve using the tax return. Obviously that's a big political challenge potentially around making self-employed people pay more, but we find it hard to see a way to do it otherwise.
I think to Adrian's point, Steve Webb's idea, is attractive, but it's not automatic enrolment, right? You can't maintain that inertia through the tax return process and the process of choosing a scheme to enrol in, and so. I think there are other pieces of work going on. So Nest Insight, our in-house think tank, is working with DWP on things that we could do in the meantime. So before we can get to a structural place, and I'm really interested in Matthew Taylor work as well, are there things you could do through platforms? So thinking about workers with some synergies to Nest membership, so Uber, Deliveroo, people working the gig economy, could you put things like set and forget mechanisms into platforms so that when you get paid, a certain amount is portioned off to a pension? So I think there are things you can do and test, and it's the right time to be doing that. The other thing I'd say is the self-employed is not amorphous. It's very, very different at different levels, and there are many more women coming into that group. There are many more low earners coming into that group. So you may well find you need different solutions for different sections of the group as well. Yeah.
But these trials that the government says it's engaging in, I think they run through to the summer of this year. What kind of things are they revealing?
So that's exactly what I was just mentioning. So Nest Insight is partnering with government to think about this platform issue and also look at behavioural prompts, so framing. So in the realms of communication, are there certain things that you could show to self-employed people, like family framing and things that would make them more inclined to save? But it is at that level, it's a sort of, for this group might this work, for this group might that work. I don't know if there's anything others want to add.
So it's either a technological solution, it may involve some kind of use of tax return, and it might have to be much more varied because they're not a single group. Well, that seems fair enough. Can I just very quickly go back to the question of micro-employers? I mean, I think Ruth raised the thing about accountants, and I think it was Nest who actually said that most very small employers tend to go down the accountant's route. I mean, is there anything that can be done to make it easier for these small employers? I think this committee originally suggested that we thought the government might consider adapting basic PAYE, the basic PAYE tool, and the government said, well, no, because we're changing that, so we don't want to go down that route. I mean, is there anything that can be done in terms of new technology that would make it easier for these very small businesses? It does seem ridiculous if the amount of pension contribution is almost as much as the accountant's fee, you can see why it doesn't work very well. Is there anything you'd recommend that would help people in that predicament at the moment?
Well, I would recommend them to use a payroll gateway. A payroll bureau, sorry, not gateway, a payroll bureau. A payroll bureau is a service that offers a number of payroll services to small employers. It sorts the pay, it's the delivery of that, it sorts the deduction of tax and national insurance, and a payroll bureau can also sort the pension contributions. So we provide software that links with payroll bureaus and makes it very, very easy for the employer and the payroll bureau to work together and send the requisite information to NOW pensions.
Anybody else like to make an advert of what they
Can I
do?
just say that it was actually a payroll bureau that was charging another £35 a month to do the pension on top of the payroll.
So a cheap payroll bureau, I think. Yeah.
By and large, our satisfaction rates for employers are really high, and they barely touch us, right? They barely call us. And I appreciate that sounds like an advert, Frank, but I think others would say this how. I think actually, when you've got straight through processing, and particularly when employers are leaning on intermediaries or other parties to help them with it, it is a very, very simple, easy process. So we shouldn't overestimate, the size of this issue, because I'm not convinced it's that large actually.
I don't have anything different to add. No.
Just the obvious point, there's no doubt a cost attached to this for micro-employers. There's no doubt about that. I guess we would argue that getting auto-enrolment is a mass system. The trade-off is more than worthwhile, but we have to acknowledge that for small employers and micro in particular, there are costs attached to this, beyond just the contributions. Cost attached.
Thank you very much. That was a really, really good session. And maybe, I hope we've proved the vigilance of nerds might result in higher pensions. Right. Thank you very much indeed.
The proceeding has ended.